Up. It's the Sleep Unplugged podcast, episode 91, Drowsy Driving, Asleep at the Wheel. Welcome, everyone, to the Sleep Unplugged podcast. My name is Chris Winter. I'm a neurologist and sleep specialist and your host. Very excited for you to be here with us today. This is an important topic and glad you're here sharing with me. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. If you're a veteran of the Sleep Unplugged podcast, welcome back. We certainly appreciate your support. So it's been a big week. I want to give a shout out to all of my spring training teams that I've worked with out in Arizona and Florida. This was an unusual week. Last week's episode on sleep and hospitality, I had actually recorded a couple weeks prior. So it was interesting to go 2 weeks without recording a podcast because I kind of had that one in the can. This is a busy time for me. I think this was maybe the 16th season I've gone out to visit particular teams and help Major League Baseball players with dealing with sleep. And it's a real honor to be able to do that. So I want to give a shout out to all of the players out there that I was able to interact with. I think somewhere on the order of 200 to 300 player interactions over this time, over several clubs. Hope you all have great, fruitful seasons and find time to sleep somewhere in between. So we generally, if you're interested in the show, we generally communicate through our social media. If you want to submit a comment, if you have an idea for a podcast episode, or generally want to interact with the show, you can do so through Instagram. That's Dr. Chris Winter. Also the same for Twitter. We have Threads, Bluesky, TikTok. It's all at Dr. Chris Winter. And we always appreciate your input. And I got a great communication from one of my listeners, and I want to share it with you. And basically, this was from Kayla. And Kayla wrote a pretty interesting question. It was about narcolepsy treatments. And we've talked about narcolepsy treatments in the past on, I believe, episode 39, narcolepsy treatments. I Want a New Drug. We just talked recently about pitolisant at the beginning of one of our episodes. And she said, "Hey, Chris, I've been listening to your podcast, specifically the narcolepsy videos, and I had several questions. Out of the medications available, which ones have the least side effects or the least risky in terms of their side effect profile? Are there any orexin agonists on the market yet? And are there any lifestyle modifications that people have shared have had success with managing excessive daytime sleepiness for narcolepsy?" And I really appreciate Kayla writing in about that. So these are three really important questions. We could probably do an entire podcast about them. And I've got a narcolepsy episode coming up that I want to do on a particular topic that's of concern to me. The first question about side effect profile, it's always difficult to know what to ask when patients say, "Okay, Chris, what are the side effects?" The side effects for medications to me are often everything. If you said, "Chris, have you ever had a patient experience headache with fill in the blank with whatever drug you're thinking about?" The answer is yes. So I think a better way for you to think about side effects of the medications that you're taking are, what are the more common side effects reported? Because every drug has, I'm not aware of any drug that has no side effects. So the narcolepsy medications all have side effects: nausea, anxiety, weight loss, tremor, enuresis, bedwetting. But maybe a better thing to talk about, what is the relative percentage of these things here? And they're usually really small, way below 10%, often below 5%, sometimes even lower than that. And then maybe a better question on top of that is, okay, well, how many of the people experiencing the side effect decided to stop the medication? I mean, when you're talking about a condition like narcolepsy that maybe you're experiencing debilitating excessive sleepiness, which he's asking about, maybe it is radically improving your sleepiness, but does cause you to have a little bit of upset stomach when you take it. So you are experiencing a side effect, but is that side effect reaching a certain threshold to make you not want to take or incapable of taking a drug? Maybe an individual, I've had patients who've taken certain medications for narcolepsy have an episode of bedwetting, but it hasn't stopped them from continuing the medication because the medications are so powerful and so effective. So all drugs have side effects. And to me, it's sort of like all sandwiches have side effects. There have been people who've gone to your favorite restaurant, ordered your favorite sandwich, and maybe choked on it, or it didn't make them feel very good, or I don't know, gave them bad breath. I mean, these are all side effects of that pastrami sandwich on rye that you love at the deli down the street. So I don't like to focus on side effects. I do like to talk about, hey, you might experience some bedwetting. This might make it a little bit more difficult for you to generate an appetite and keep some weight on. But in terms of which ones are the least risky, I don't really find any of these medications risky, nor do I find the restless leg drugs risky. Do I find the drugs we would use for periodic limb movement or acid reflux risky? Are there any orexin agonists on the market? I won't get into that. The simple answer is no, but they're certainly in development. And then the lifestyle modification I want to touch on very quickly. I don't know that there's a lot of effective lifestyle modifications. And the comment that I'd made to her when I responded to the question is, it's kind of like having 2300 vision, really, really bad vision, and saying, God, doc, yeah, I really was trying to avoid the glasses, contact, LASIK. Any lifestyle modifications that I could do to fix this problem? I mean, you might be able to say napping for in the case of narcolepsy, but in my experience, and there are exceptions, this is such a profoundly debilitating condition that there's not a lot of lifestyle modifications you can do to make it better. It's a profound, and it's a profound condition. Now, you don't have to treat it. If you have 2300 vision, you don't have to treat that either. You can just live a life of blurred vision if you want to. That's fine. But you know, what can you do other than changing the way light interacts with the retina of your eye? Probably not a whole lot. But these are great questions, Kayla. I really appreciate you asking them and sharing that. And hopefully that was helpful to a lot of patients out there who are trying to decide what to do with a diagnosis like narcolepsy. So before we get into the show, the title of the podcast is Asleep at the Wheel, which is actually a band. It's a country western band, won a bunch of Grammys, and they've been around forever. But this is actually referring to a song by the Wallflowers off of their debut album, Wallflowers, which was 1992. Wallflowers, of course, featuring the son of Bob Dylan, Jacob Dylan. We talked about Bob Dylan last week, so I thought this was a natural band to talk about. Jacob Dylan out with his band out in LA was, playing the club scene, and there's a great club scene out in LA, particularly in the 70s and 80s, and this would have been the early 90s. And he got discovered your Bob Dylan's son, put this album together, and it didn't do that well. And he kind of lost his record deal because his debut album was not great. This was one of the songs on it. It was Asleep at the Wheel, had another great song, Be Your Own Girl, which I always thought was a fantastic song. There was also a song on that debut album, Ashes to Ashes, which is not the David Bowie song. It's not a cover. It's an original song. So he comes out with his second album, Bringing Down the Horse, and it's huge. Sixth Avenue, Heartache, One Headlight, was it Three Marlenas? There was several big hits on that, multiple awards and Grammy nominations, and that was it's a huge album. And a lot of people rediscovered his first album after his second album. And just a real quick David Bowie. We always relate things to David Bowie. His second album, he actually did a cover of Heroes, and that's on the extended version of the second album, if you like it. The other song I will mention that I almost put on here as the title of the show was a song by Billy Strings off of his fourth studio album, and it was called Highway Hypnosis. And here's a great line from Highway Hypnosis: white lines and traffic signs, there ain't nothing I ain't missing. I can't stay, I'm in a driving daze, I'm consciously road tripping. So anyway, great songs about excessive sleepiness. We could have gone certainly Matchbox 20 was Sleeping at the Wheel, but we'll stick with Wallflowers for this week. And of all the music we talk about on the show you can find on the Spotify playlist under Sleep Unplugged. So I was thinking about this episode and it kind of popped in my mind. I was watching a rerun of Seinfeld, and this was such a fantastic episode where Jerry's dating a dermatologist, I believe was played by Marcia Cross, who was on Melrose Place. And he's dating her, and at some point she says something about saving people's lives as a doctor. And he kind of makes this kind of questioning face like, what? And so he's talking to, Elaine and George at some point, like, yeah, I just can't stop thinking about the fact that she's going around talking about saving people's lives. I mean, she's a dermatologist. She's like a pimple popper. And that was sort of the line from the show. And then at some point later on, he confronts her and she's like, of course I save people's lives. Skin cancer. And he's like, oh, skin cancer. Of course, I forgot about that. So there's that one thing that doctor does that actually saves lives. I would argue that dermatologists do all kinds of things that save lives, but that was the joke of the show. So I was thinking, do sleep doctors save lives? And I think that when you think about there's one category kind of like skin cancer where I believe that we do, and I think it has to do with the detection and prevention of sleepy driving or the elimination of causes of sleepy driving. And sleepy driving to me is at the top of the pyramid when it comes to patient considerations. Like I want to make sure that my patients are not engaged in driving when they're sleepy, because that is the one thing that can hurt them. If they have narcolepsy and they're taking a medication that might have risks, like we talk about oxybate, a drug for narcolepsy you take when you go to bed, but it's sedating, similar to GHB. So I need that patient to take the drug, but then have 6 hours before they drive an automobile. So, we're constantly talking, you got to be very careful. Like if this drug's in your system, you cannot drive. And if you have untreated narcolepsy, you need to be very careful driving. It can be dangerous, and so on and on. If you have narcolepsy, you can't have a commercial driver's license. Driving. Pilots famously avoid sleep doctors. In fact, I just saw some article where they were saying, look, we have a problem with pilots not going to doctors because they're scared they're going to lose their license and their livelihood. I think sleep is a big one that they do not talk about with us. So I think that sleep and driving has a unique relationship. And it's really unique in my situation because I have actually been an expert witness in cases regarding sleepy driving. And I'm not going to get into the legality of it because I'm certainly not a lawyer. But if you look at a lot of states, they have very stiff judgmental penalties for individuals who drive while knowingly intoxicated with alcohol. Most states have virtually no laws dealing with individuals who knowingly engage in driving when they're sleeping. So an individual goes out there, he's been up all night, they've been up all night, whatever, and they knowingly get behind the wheel of the car and drive home, and they hurt somebody or kill somebody. In the case that I was involved in, this individual crashed into a car and killed everybody. It was 4 college students and they killed them all, and had done something similar in the past related to excessive sleepiness. So I was a witness for essentially the state because they were seeking damages beyond what was typically done in these cases because they felt like they wanted to set an example, a new example. And they actually won, which was kind of a landmark sort of situation. And you can probably look it up in Culpeper. I think it's probably open, it's public knowledge now if you're really interested in that kind of thing. So why do we care? It's, what's the scope of the problem? Well, the CDC did a survey and they estimated that 1 in 25 adults, and we're talking 18 years or older, has reported falling asleep while driving in the last 30 days. And this is relatively older data. So this is not just drowsy driving. These are people saying, look, yeah, in the last month, I have actually fallen asleep while driving. And if you're a sleep specialist, we've talked about the Epworth Sleepiness Scale before, the famously imperfect scale that we ask people, hey, in a scale of, no chance, slight chance, 50-50 definite, how likely would it be for you to fall asleep reading a book, watching television, passenger in a car for an hour without a break, sitting quietly after lunch? Well, one of them is driving a car that you're operating while stopped at a stoplight or stuck in traffic? What is the likelihood that you would fall asleep in that situation? No chance, slight chance, 50-50 definite. Slight chance, if you answer that, is probably, yeah, once a month. 50-50, multiple times, many more frequent, much more frequent than that. I've never had in my career somebody say, oh, I definitely fall asleep if I'm driving a car. I mean, I think those people die, right? They don't make it to see me if they're that sleepy. Or I think that they're so profoundly sleepy, they've chosen not to drive. So we routinely screen for this. I mean, my dogma is you ask every patient that comes to your clinic, if you're a ball player, those questions I just said, if you're listening to this podcast and you're one of the baseball players that I've been speaking to, you recognize that question, right? Because I ask every one of my ball players every time I see them the Epworth sleepiness scale. How likely are you to fall asleep driving a car? If the answer is, yeah, I do it quite a bit, we're going to have a conversation about it. We need to figure out why. Not getting enough sleep, something wrong with your sleep. So it's estimated that 91,000 reported crashes every year involve drowsy drivers. And that leads to 50,000 injuries and about 800 deaths per year. In 2020, it was reported to be about 633, but it's widely known that these things are really underestimated. Plus, if I remember correctly, 2020 was a year that you probably weren't doing a lot of driving anywhere unless it involved a tip that a Walgreens had toilet paper. So 2020 was probably a very skewed year, in addition to the fact that we just don't report these things particularly well. So 16.5% of these crashes are fatal. 13% lead to hospitalization type injuries. And when you look at individuals who are struggling with automobile accidents, you're 1.5 to 4 times more likely to be in an accident if you're a drowsy driver than you are if you're not. So I'm very risk averse. I've noticed as I've gotten older, I drive slower. I've really been trying to, just put all the distractions away when I drive and really just focus on, I don't want to be in a car. I don't have time today to be in a car accident or a fender bender. So sleepiness is a big risk factor. If you're trying to avoid that in your life, being well rested is a great way to do that. And what I really find interesting, and this probably kind of goes back to our episode we did on shift work. Well, if you look in 24 hours, when are these accidents much more likely to happen? It's generally between midnight and 6 a.m. It's widely known that sort of 3 to 4 a.m. time period in an individual on a typical schedule is probably the point in their day that their drive to sleep is the highest. This is the time where accidents happen, and which is always worrisome if you've got teens or young drivers who are getting up early to drive to school to retake a test, or getting up early on Saturday to go take the SAT. You're putting an inexperienced young driver and waking them up and having them drive in the place where accidents are much more likely, both themselves, but the people around them to be in one. So we have to be very careful with this. These accidents often involve single passengers for obvious reasons, right? If your car is full of people talking, interacting, hey, that was fun, going out for the dollar Guinness at St. Patrick's Day or whatever, you've got people in there talking, you've got a designated driver, there's conversations happening to keep people awake when they're driving. When you're a solo driver, that's not necessarily the case. They also often happen on rural highways and sort of a little bit more remote roads, and often happen in and around where you live. It's amazing to me as a clinician when I talk to people who've had accidents, how many say, they were driving back from New Jersey, they got off the interstate, they were 3 miles from home, made a right at the Wawa to go down the road to where they live, and ended up in a ditch in their neighbor's house. It's like right there at the end, they just couldn't hang on anymore. And so when we think about these accidents, and if you've ever driven sleep deprived, and when I look at these statistics and read stories, and I always think about residency. I lived very close to where I worked when I was a resident at the University of Virginia. It was not a difficult drive. It was a pretty close drive. And I remember being so sleepy sometimes. I remember I did get pulled over one time leaving the hospital. I think I was driving too slowly, and the police officer and I talked for a minute and kind of let me off with a warning. But I'm sure that my driving did not look to be particularly great. I also remember another time of being unbelievably sleep deprived and was driving. And as I was driving, it was one of those things where you knew it. I was like, I need to find a gas station. I'm going to pull over and get a drink and just take a break because I'm really sleepy. And I remember waking up just sort of in the road. Like I had just driven and then slowed down and then stopped. And I was just stopped right in the middle of the road. Now, fortunately, there was no other cars around. It was like, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning. I think I was driving to Pittsburgh or something like that. And I remember just kind of waking up and like, oh my God, and just started driving again and thought, this is not good. So, I mean, these are terribly scary stories. And what was always remarkable to me, it was when I would have one of these episodes where you hit the rumble track. Whoever created the rumble strip on the side of the road, I've looked it up several times in my lifetime. I can never commit it to memory. That individual should be given a Nobel Prize. I mean, I'm not taking away from any Nobel Prizes that have been given since the rumble strip on the side of the highway has been invented. How many lives has that guy saved? I mean, come on, like this is penicillin level. I know he saved my life. Hit that rumble thing on this, and you kind of wake up and oh my God, oh whoa. I was checked out there for a minute. But what's always shocking to me is like you wake up when you hit that rumble strip and you are awake. Man, you are super awake, heart's beating in your chest. Oh my God. You regain, get the car straight in the lane again. And then 5 minutes later, you're kind of back to doing it again. It's always shocking to me how quickly that adrenaline surge that wakes you up goes away. So sleepiness happens quickly. It really does. And I love the warning systems in new cars these days that, a little coffee cup comes up, says, hey, why don't you take a break? I always answer it, why don't you just mind your own business, kind of the conversation like it's Kit from Knight Rider or something. So, how impaired are we? Is this kind of being overblown? Like, what is the level of impairment? And I'll say this, when you combine excessive sleepiness and alcohol, it's like a 1 + 1 = 7 kind of situation. But let's take that out. Let's not talk about the additional or the synergistic impairment. Let's talk about what is the impairment of a sleepy driver? What is the impairment of a drunk driver? And how do we compare those? And it's thought that 24 hours of sleep deprivation. So again, we're back to residency again. You were up, you got to the hospital at 5 a.m., rounded on your patients or whatever, and then the professor came or whatever, you rounded at 6, 7 a.m. You worked all day. You were on call that night, so you worked all night, got everybody tucked away. And at some point the next day, maybe as late as 5 p.m., you left. So there were times where we went way over 24 hours without sleep. And I'm sure current residents right now do if you're in a busy situation. Now, there are duty restrictions, but busy night on call, you may never see a bed. So you've been up for 24 hours. That's equivalent for somebody my size, about 150, 160 pounds in that range, to having a blood alcohol content of 0.1%. So looking that up, that's equivalent to me having about 4 to 5 drinks and being legally intoxicated. So think about that, because that situation in a lot of places has absolutely no legal repercussion. Did I know I have stayed up for 24 hours? Yeah, of course I did. Yeah, I've been running around. Everybody knows. Just talk to all the doctors in the ER, my interns, and everybody else on the team. Like, yes, of course. I'm aware that I've been up for 24 hours. So this isn't like an accidental thing. I could have said, look, I've been up for 24 hours. I'm off duty now. Instead of getting in my car and going home to see my family, I'm going to go to the call room and sleep. I mean, maybe, when I was chief resident, that's what we should have done. It's like the fishbowl, right? Okay, everybody put your keys in the fishbowl when you arrive at the party. And then I decide if you can drive. I mean, we were so hung up on, hey, how many hours have you been here? We got to be in compliance with these duty hours. Maybe what I should have been doing was saying, hey, okay, duty hours, great. Are you okay? Like, where are you driving? One of the residents that I worked with when I was chief, that one of the younger residents lived like 28 minutes away in a town called Lovingston. I mean, that was a long drive. It was a rural road. Driving home on that, you would not have seen anybody, kind of windy around, nothing to look at, kind of boring. You're by yourself because you're coming off of college, nobody there with you. That guy was probably in a lot of danger if you think about it. So anyway, who's at the greatest risk? Teen drivers. Young adults and teens are by far and away at the greatest risk for doing this. Probably the only saving thing from them is parents maybe not allowing them to do big drives, the fact that they're in school. So there's probably some things that work towards protecting them a little bit. I mean, my teen drivers, we really made our kids wait until they were, much more practiced before they could drive. And none of our teen drivers were driving, late into the night for 3 or 4 hours. However, I had a son who is a fairly elite swimmer. And I remember I'd have to get up really early every day of the week, including weekends, and take him to practice. And when he turned 16, I think we did a very short period of time where I got up and we drove. He drove, and then I was the observer. But, I'm sure I kind of folded to, okay, he's good enough, and the pool's nearby. So, I mean, this is a teen driver getting up, I mean, obscenely early. I mean, he was probably at fairly high risk for having an accident. I mean, he always seemed to handle it pretty well, but anyway, so it's very scary to think about this kind of stuff. Drivers who are on the road between midnight and 6 a.m. are much, much greater risk. And that swimmer was right in the sweet spot, right? There's no such thing as like the swim team in high school that practices at 4 p.m. That's like unheard of. They always practice first thing in the morning. So, huge risk factor there for him. Drivers who are not getting enough sleep. Okay, got a high school student here, and some, he's staying up late, getting ready for his calculus exam and all this stuff. So I was always struck by my swimmer, who would always basically be like, okay, it's 10 o'clock, I'm going to bed. I'm like, really? You got all your work done? Don't you have a test or something tomorrow? Like, he, to his credit, was always extremely disciplined about, it's 10, I've got to go to bed. I can't not. So if I don't get the work done, I don't get the work done. Maybe I'll do it on the pool deck tomorrow. It just doesn't matter, versus my daughter, who would routinely stay up late to get stuff done, and do it really well, or I need to study more, just kind of one of those driven sort of students. So that sleep deprivation that she's creating was putting her at risk when she drove. Commercial truck drivers, they've enacted duty laws, kind of like the residents have, which kind of help, but commercial truck drivers are at great risk, I think, based upon what they have to do for a living. Drivers who work night shifts or long shifts, double shifts. Hey, I worked a double because I'm making up for being out of town, or I was covering for a friend. That's a huge risk factor when it comes to drowsy drivers and sleep. Individuals with untreated sleep disorders and individuals who take medicines to make them sleepy. I'm going to focus on the untreated sleep disorder. When I talk to an individual who's a shift worker, when I talk to somebody who I think is at great risk for sleepy driving, the conversation I always have is, you cannot drive sleepy. You could kill yourself. You could kill others. And they're like, okay, great, but I've got to work. And nobody's driving me to work unless you want to come drive. You could drop your son off at swimming and then you come pick me up and take me to work if you want to. But my guess is you don't want to do that. No, I don't. Okay, well, then I'm going to drive. I'm going to go to work. I'm going to drive, and I'm going to work too. Jobs. When I think about those patients and what I can do besides warn them from my pedestal on high, which is, I mean, how useless does that look? I got to work 2 jobs. That's how I pay my mortgage, and maybe I drive an Uber in between those 2 jobs sometimes. So like, this is the reality of my financial situation. I hear you, Chris, appreciate your concern, but what can I do here? I need the money. So with those individuals, I am adamant about making sure that, look, if you're going to engage in these things and you're checking off drowsy driving risk factors, I need to make sure that you do not have an underlying sleep problem. Do you snore? Do your legs feel restless? Do you have signs and symptoms of narcolepsy? Let's go down the list of the 88 diagnosable sleep disorders and let's talk about them all. Because if I'm going to set you free out there to drive at 3 o'clock in the morning to your first job, I want to make really sure that your sleep quality is as great as it can be when that quantity sometimes gets reduced because of your work. So if you're somebody who you think is at risk for drowsy driving, let's save a life. Let's save a life with the podcast right now. If you're somebody who thinks you're at risk for drowsy driving, or you know somebody, love somebody, married to somebody who is, you're like, yeah, I mean, my partner's got a pretty rough schedule and he works 2 jobs and he does snore and he does stop breathing at night and he does act out his dreams and kick his legs and thrash around and moan in his sleep and talk in his sleep. If that's the situation, taking pills to help him sleep. Oh my God, he's working 2 jobs and he takes sleeping pills, a little bit of alcohol to help him sleep. Chris, he just kind of uses the alcohol to wind down because he's, so stressed out about work. Listen, we need to talk about that. You need to get that individual to a sleep specialist, and there's a lot of good ones out there. There was a 2017 study that looked at 1,675 individuals. Mean age was 43. 66% of them were men, and this was self-reported individuals driving drowsy. 23% of these individuals experienced dozing at the wheel. The self-reported drowsy driving of this population was about 23.6%. So 400 of the 1675 said, yeah, I drive drowsy. 33% of them experienced dozing off at least once a month. So these are high numbers, and they're often men, more men than women. So let's be very careful out there if you know people who fit this category. Here's a great one. This was a 2018 study looking at about 400 drivers in Fairfax. And the question was, when you're looking at these individuals, who's at greater risk for drowsy driving? Night owls or individuals who are morning types? So of these surveyed students, these are students, 400 students, somewhere on the order of late night chronotypes, if you're a night owl, you were about 15% more likely to be a drowsy driver than if you were a morning person, which I thought was really interesting. You could maybe paint the picture of, well, Chris, maybe your swimmer's son was a morning person. So by 10 o'clock, he's like, I don't want to go anywhere. I don't want to do any kind of driving at night. Too tired. I want to go to bed. Versus the night owls might be more likely to sort of push it a little bit later, which is kind of interesting. So in the last part of the episode, I really want to talk about what do we do to prevent it? Like, what are our tips for not? So it's to me, it's sort of like the number one tip for getting out of trouble is to not get into trouble, right? So I think tip number one is get adequate sleep, and we could close the podcast with that. Look, forget the rest of the tips. You just got to get adequate sleep. That's the number one way to ensure that you're not going to have difficulty with excessive sleepiness when you drive. Number two, before you do any sort of long haul drive, I think it's really important for you to make sure in those days leading up to it, you're getting great sleep. And, I think this is very particularly relevant to teen drivers because they're not getting often the sleep that they need. So mom and dad, you need to really be, or mom and mom, dad and dad, mom by herself, dad by herself, the grandparents raising, whoever you are, whatever parenting group I'm speaking to here, you've got to make sure that your kids or the people that you take care of and love are getting adequate sleep. There is no drinking with sleep deprivation. So you cannot couple that. And in the case that I was involved with, I remember this guy had stayed up all night, had helped a friend move some furniture, had a long, long night, stayed up all night, and at some point when he was done, had a beer, one beer. I'll tell you that one beer probably acted like 3 or 4 in that situation. I mean, that beer, I remember being so sleep deprived in residency. And then you get home after being on call or whatever, and you know, 5 o'clock, and I'd be so tired. And you get home like, okay, Chris, why don't you shower off? You smell like a hospital because we're gonna go over to our friend's house and have dinner. And you're like, oh, okay, great. You get over there and you try to rally. The shower made you feel pretty good, and you're kind of catching your second wind. And while you're waiting for the burgers to grill or whatever, your buddy gives you a beer, and you're like, oh yeah, great. Let's have a little rolling rock here while we talk and talk about stuff. And I fell asleep all the time at dinner parties, like at the table. So now they're talking about their amazing trip to Turks and Caicos or whatever, and you're like, oh, that sounds great. Tell me more about it. And then I'm asleep and it was sort of like, well, yeah, it's Chris. He falls asleep sometimes. So I always intentionally tried not to sit in comfortable places when I would go to somebody's house to enjoy their hospitality. So if you're drowsy, you cannot have alcohol. It's not part of the equation. Always make sure that the medications you're taking are not drugs that also create drowsiness. Again, it's all about risk factor mitigation. We can eliminate the alcohol risk factor. We can eliminate the medication that make you feel sleepy risk factor. Like we can kind of check our list down as we go. If you're driving, it's really best to try to avoid that midnight to 6 a.m. window. And I'm really guilty of, I like driving at night. There's not that many people on the road. There's very little traffic. It's a little bit more peaceful to me. So I often would seek those times, but it's really important not to. That's not a safe time for most of us to be driving. And one more thing I'll say about the evaluation of this. So Chris, is there a way to test somebody to see if they're in danger of drowsy driving? There is a test called the maintenance of wakefulness test. It's a test similar to the MSLT we talked about, where you come in, you sit down at a desk, and for 40 minutes, your job is to stay awake. And you do it 4 times. So you do it for 40 minutes, then you take a 2-hour break, 40 minutes, take a 2-hour break, 40 minutes. And so the problem with it is it's very difficult to know how to interpret it, meaning that we know that if you fall asleep in fewer than 8 minutes on average in those nap opportunities, those wakefulness periods, then that would be excessively sleepy. If you made it through all 40 and didn't fall asleep, we could say, well, we can tell this person can at least stay awake for 40 minutes. But that zone between 8 and 40, we really don't know what to do with. There was a study that looked at driving simulator performance, and it seemed to really deteriorate if that individual could not maintain wakefulness for an average of 19 minutes or longer. Another study felt like the cutoff for impairment was closer to 34. And I sat through a maintenance of wakefulness test once, and it's not fun. Sitting there in a kind of dimly lit room at a desk for 40 minutes, trying to stay awake several times during the day is a lot harder than it would appear. So are there great tests for who's going to fall asleep, who's going to not fall asleep when they're drowsy? There really isn't. So get your sleep, take care of risk factors that might eliminate, and be smart about when you're driving, how long you're driving. Take breaks when you drive if you have to. And I think caffeine can be helpful as well too. So that's it. Drowsy driving, done and dusted. Really appreciate tuning in. If you have any questions, comments, stories about drowsy driving, let us know at Dr. Chris Winter, Twitter, Dr. Chris Winter, Instagram. You can find our videos of the show on the YouTube page. Thank you for listening. If you want to get in touch with the show, please do. I have 2 books, Sleep Solution, Why Your Sleep Broken Down and Fix It, as well as The Rested Child. Don't drive sleepy. Don't let your friends drive sleepy. And until next week, sleep well.